Okay, so we are on Genesis. I'm getting used to our little clicker here. I feel like I have the power. It's kind of like a lightsaber. It does like a little laser pointer too. So we won't do that tonight. We'll just do the clicker. So I'll do a little bit of review. Let's see. So Pastor Jeff I've been talking with him about this series for a long time. We talk about stuff all the time. And finally got to a place where we felt like this was a really good environment to sort of unpack some of these ideas. And he's got a lot of study. He's been looking at this stuff for a long time. And I have too, but he's really gotten into it. And I hope I don't know how long we'll do this series here, but I know we'll do Genesis, but it's more than Genesis. So a lot of subject matter that comes along with it for probably quite some time, whether it's a podcast or a video podcast or something like that, because there's just so much. It's really endless. Every sort of answer you get just ask more questions, so you can keep digging in this story. And so let's do some reviews. So week one, he asked a simple question: is Earth special? On the surface, it seems like a very obviously no or obviously yes, depending on who you ask. To me, it seems obvious. Whether we find life out there or not, there's a whole lot of not life. We're sure of that. And life is abundant here, and to me that's a little strange. In the middle of all this vastness, that this place is just teeming with life. So his answer was yes, and he pointed out a lot of really amazing. It's called the Goldilocks kind of situation, where if things are a little bit different this way or that, the whole thing falls apart. So it's special in that, yes, there's life here, but it's also like what it takes for this kind of life to be in abundance is extraordinary. It's so overwhelming, the evidence toward something being designed. For me, it's hard to ignore. You have to really, really go to great lengths, I think, of faith to ignore those things. But a lot of people don't. They don't see it that way. And, this is just, there's different ways to approach these things. If that's not, if it's not that obvious to you, maybe there's something else that will come along that will help you enter into the scriptures in Genesis. So the second week we got into this idea that Genesis is not an exhaustive study of the universe, but a simple focus on the earth and its present purpose. That's a really important sort of way to begin with the subject matter. Like I said, it's really deep, and there's a lot you can do with it, but you can kind of miss the, what's the saying, forest for the trees. You get really into it and sort of miss the sort of beauty and elegance of the way the story is told. And so there's both ways of looking at it. I think the simple story is more important. The simple truths there that resonate deep in our soul. To me, that's more important. The other stuff, I love it. I geek out on it. But to me, it's a little bit secondary. So the third week, we broke down in a little bit more analytical way the book of Genesis. The author believed to be Moses. Time around 1688 BC. That's around 4,000 years ago. Book is broken down into two sections. Genesis has two parts, 1 through 11, which covers God's relationship with the whole world at a specific time. Then chapters 12 through 50 covers God's relationship with a specific person, Abraham and his family. And I remember as a young kid reading Genesis and just kind of finding that out for myself. Like, this story just changed. The whole tone of it went from this I hate to use the word fairy tale, but a very sort of poetic way of speaking into like really specific sort of storytelling. So it's just broken up into, they're both fascinating. The first part, it'll take us, I think, a while. We could dig in the first 11 chapters for a long time before we even get to Abraham. But the whole thing is important. It's all important. And and also he gets into the creation stories about making earth habitable again. He got into a little bit of theories about creation and sort of recreation, that there was sort of something else that happened first, and there was kind of a recreation, and that's where this story sort of takes off. That's more where I lean personally. Other people don't. That's all right. The fourth week, Pastor Katrina spoke. She got into a little bit of theories as well, the gap theory, and a whole lot of other things here. Really good. I don't have time to go into it all, but a couple highlights. Creation from nothing, or creation that's from nothing, and made that's from something. And then she got into kingdom, creation laws and principles, law of creation, what we say we will see, law of reproduction. We reproduce after our kind. That's an important one. I think that's one to take note of. The law of blessing. Blessing creates multiplication. Law of dominion. Must take our God-given authority. And law of rest. Rest allows God to work through us. So that brings us to tonight. And we've been doing this kind of circling of zooming in to specifics of the book and zooming out. And I think that's a really smart way to approach this book, because you can get a little more perspective about what we're talking about. So we're talking about Genesis, but this book brings up a sort of Pandora's box of questions. So you almost immediately start having a conversation about science, Scripture. What is Scripture? How is it written? Where did it come from? How can it be viewed? How has it been viewed? How do we engage with it now? I mean, there's a lot there, and I think it's all important. Eventually, you need to look at all these aspects of things. There's a lot to unpack. At the same time, I just want to, tonight, I want to get, I'll sort of be zooming out a little bit more and talking a little bit more about what I call the simple truths and beauty of Genesis that gets through a lot of complex things in a simple way. And there's really something special about that. So actually, I want to start to, not in Genesis, but I want to start in Corinthians, actually. So this is the thing, like Genesis doesn't exist in a vacuum. So we're not, I came to Christ not specifically through Genesis. Some of these guys Jeff has been talking about, these scientists and stuff, that was a big part. For me, it was Christ. So we see that in these scriptures of the Old Testament in light of Christ. So it's not a story that just exists by itself. So I think it's perfectly reasonable for us to view these things in light of other scriptures. It helps us understand it. So I want to start here. This is 1 Corinthians 13:12 through 13. This is the Amplified version. It's one of my favorite verses. It's Paul writing here. So 12, I'll just read through it here. That's a little tiny to see. So it says, "For now, in this time of imperfection, we see in a mirror dimly, a blurred reflection, a riddle, an enigma. But then, when the time of perfection comes, we will see reality face to face. Now I know in part, just in fragments, but then I will know fully, just as I have been fully known by God. And now there remain faith, abiding trust in God and his promises, hope, confident expectation of eternal salvation, love, unselfish love for others growing out of God's love for me. These three things, the choicest graces, but the greatest of these is love. So you could say, why am I starting here? I think it's important because the content is so sensitive. It can be so sensitive so quickly. And people have fought over this stuff for a long time. And churches have been split over it. There's been wars fought over this stuff. There's a bloody history in the church over this stuff. So we need to keep this in mind. How do we approach these sensitive subjects with a critical mind, still having faith, hope, and love? I think these should be guiding lights as we sort of try to create an environment where we can talk about these things, because it can quickly shift from like a fun conversation about Genesis to people fighting, and people are really passionate about this stuff. As they should be, that's fine. You know, I personally take a little bit different view, and I hope I can get into some of how tonight, how I'm able to engage with the Bible, really, but especially Genesis. So if we can agree that in this present time we are not and will not for now have complete 100 accurate understanding of our world, that'll help us a lot. Just chill. Back up, everybody, before you get ready to fight, because it immediately starts and everybody's got their books they've read and they're ready to go at it. So a little humility goes a long way, I think. A lot of times with this, there's two things that sort of inform these heated debates sometimes. Some of it's fear, because people feel like if I cave on this issue here, the whole thing's going to fall apart. And the other is hubris, where people are just really think they know a lot. They've gone to some schools, they've had some schooling, and they're going to tell you what's up, and that's that. So it's a little hard to have a dialogue with somebody who already knows it all about something. So if we want to learn about things, a little humility is necessary, because you got to be able to understand that we don't fully see it, and that's the only way we can allow ourselves to receive the knowledge on these things. So there's lots of different ways to approaching the scriptures. I love the subject matter. But it's sensitive, and that's okay, because this is important stuff, and we should be taking it seriously, but at the same time, out of following this beacon of love, hope, and faith, hopefully. So Pastor Jeff has been starting off each of these, and I really like kind of the format he's getting into, with some kind of biographical stories of scientists and people who've come to faith. I think all of them, I'm not sure, but most of them have been sort of scientists who were atheists who then came to faith. And I feel like those are amazing stories. I love them. There's lots of them, and they continue to happen. I do feel like, and I've read a lot of books with that kind of content, and I feel like a lot of the argument over, I don't know, the last 50 years or so at least, has been sort of pitting those two ideas against each other, sort of the atheist versus the faith believer, and it's kind of a staunch atheist and sort of a staunch believer, and sometimes both sides can get a little top-heavy, and they're a little easy to knock over, I think. And I think these days we're dealing with a little bit of the argument's going to start to change a little bit in the culture in some ways. I think. I think there's, and there'll always be scientists, and I love science, I really do. I'm a fan, but a lot of these guys, they're not always the best theologians. they're really brilliant in some ways and really not in others. And we all do this. We have our gifts and our weaknesses. Some don't. I mean, some have all of it in spades, but a lot of them, and they can be really aggressive and kind of like it's a type of thinking, and it really helps them do certain things, but it doesn't help in other abstract ways. So I'd like to start tonight with this fella here. Anybody know who that is? No? Bearded guy? Old guy? Close. Galileo. So Galileo, I was going to play Bohemian Rhapsody. I didn't know if any fans of that one. It's one of my favorites. It's fascinating. I'll tell you what, I heard I was going to teach like a day ago or 2 days ago, and so I started studying. And I got stuck on the subject of Galileo for like almost the whole time. It's an endless study, and it's fascinating. I love it if you ever want to get into the story of Galileo. So I'll just do a little bit of highlights about his life. He helped dramatically advance the creation of the telescope. Telescopes existed before, but he kind of came along and was like, these guys didn't even know what they had, and really turned it into something special there. He had a lot of discoveries about the solar system. He's considered to be, by many, the father of modern science. And again, I was talking about this view of kind of science versus faith. And you can see in the history of Galileo where this kind of started. And he's known to, oh, there's his telescope and his cool socks. And so here it is. He was brought before the Inquisition. And so Europe was suffering these bloody wars between Protestants and Catholics. And I know, like I said, this is rich history here, this whole subject matter. It's amazing, it's brutal and beautiful, and you should go check it out. I don't have time to go into all of it, but I just want to use it as kind of a sort of way of making a point here later on. So the Inquisition, again, this is not exhaustive. I'm just giving you sort of hyper cliff notes here. Was the Catholic Church was charged with eradicating heresies. It's the Middle Ages, around 12th century. Councils began to prosecute heretics. This led to prosecution and torture of many different people groups and those holding views that oppose church doctrine. So during this time, the church and the state had really got wrapped up together. So there was a lot of crazy stuff happening. And some of this was, like I said, the fear of losing power. So they really were being staunch about church doctrine, because if they felt like if they gave on these certain issues, they would lose power. And I think that informed a lot of this, really. And it's really, really unfortunate stuff in the history of the church. But we need to look at it. I think it's really important not to just sort of brush over these parts of our church history that are not convenient and not nice and not pretty. You don't want to just sweep this stuff under the rug. Anyways, that's not really my point to get into the Inquisition. But it's fascinating, this trial. In hindsight, some of it seems ridiculous, what they're fighting over. So he finds himself on trial because he championed the Copernican doctrine that the sun is the center of the universe. Thank you. That was my next point, sir. He's on top of science tonight. So Aristotelian science had become part of the church doctrine, and they believed the earth was at the center of the universe. For the church, if Aristotle was wrong, Christianity was wrong. They put a lot of their eggs in that basket. Okay? And sort of making a point here about how we view Genesis. When we get into this stuff, we can get really strong about certain points that we don't necessarily have to. It's not a make or break issue. They were ready to kill people over the earth being at the center of the world, of the universe. It's ridiculous. So check this out. Here's the map. That's what they believed. Earth at center. It's pretty cool. Beautiful maps, by the way. I got into all these maps of the universe. They're awesome. They're so amazing. That was Aristotelian. And there's Copernicus. It's so different. They just swapped out the middle. Now the sun is at the middle. I know that's hard to read, but it's basically concentric circles. That center is the sun. This other one has the earth at the center. So it's easy to see these things in hindsight. Obviously, this happens a lot, to look at history and be like, what were they thinking? But just, again, humility is key here, because that's going to happen to us too. A couple hundred years, they'll look back at some of the things we do, trust me, and they'll be like, what were they thinking? How did they believe that? That is so ridiculous. That doesn't justify it, but I'm just saying these were like, they didn't know a lot, okay? They were trying to understand the universe, and they think it's this way, and suddenly somebody comes along and says, nope, it's like this, and the whole world shifts under their feet. That's hard. That's hard, and that's not over. Those days are not over. Trust me. We're going to have discoveries. It's going to continue to happen, and it's going to blow our minds, and we're going to have to reorient ourselves and have to deal with how that affects our faith. What does that do? And if you're putting all your eggs in the Aristotle basket, you're in trouble. All right? So just be careful about making concrete theological dogma about things you don't have to. Even if you believe it, you don't necessarily have to die on that hill, right? The other interesting thing here, I was reading a couple different sources, but they were talking about Galileo, and again, this is a heated, I didn't realize how heated it is, but people have been fighting over just this trial that he had for a long time. And they're just now, this past week, they're finding more discoveries about it, because they were writing back and forth these letters, and there's all this intrigue with it. It's really cool stuff, but people are getting into his letters and rewriting them as if he did it, and there are all these people fighting and infighting, and so they found a letter where just recently he had changed some things, and they were very specific about the type of, and he was really a smart guy, so he was like outwitting the people who were putting him on trial by just using clever words to sort of keep his belief but not offend these people. And but he was some people say he was kind of a jerk, Galileo. He was really smart. He had contempt for lesser minds. He knew a lot, but he didn't know as much as he thought he did. That's a theme we're going to keep hitting at. He knew a lot, genius, smart guy, didn't know as much as he thought, okay? Thought he had it all figured out, and this is how it is. He's actually wrong. They're both wrong. They're both wrong, like really wrong. They didn't know. So it's interesting here, too, with him. He didn't make it easy on him, and this is the sort of antagonism we find between science and faith a lot of times, because these guys are not always being super nice about faith, and they're calling you, dummies or whatever, and so it can be easy to get into a just tit-for-tat fight, we'll try to gotcha kind of things. And sometimes these atheist scientist conversions are a little bit of a gotcha, like, see, this smart guy believes it, and I love them, like I said, but they can be a little bit of a gotcha. But the interesting thing about Galileo, too, is he was actually a man of faith and science. He didn't see those as opposing things. And this is a note here from one of his letters. They were writing back and forth. This is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. In one of his letters, he had argued that, of course, the Bible was an inspired text, yet two truths could not contradict one another. So in cases where it was known that science had achieved a true result, the Bible ought to be interpreted in such a way that makes it compatible with this truth. The Bible, he argued, was a historical document written for common people at a historical time, and it had to be written in a language that would make sense to them and lead them towards the true religion. That's a mouthful. There's a lot there to unpack. Excuse me. But it gets at, I think, an interesting point about how we engage with scriptures. These things didn't exist in a vacuum. They were written at a specific time with specific people during a specific culture with various ways and various understanding. Galileo didn't know a lot. He knew a lot. He was a genius at his time, but they didn't know a lot. And the people before them, we've been slowly discovering. And we're still scratching the surface, guys. And as much as deep as our knowledge is of the universe, there's a lot more to learn. And so I think one of the beauties of Scripture is that it transcends a lot of these times, different times of understanding. So this same story that we're reading was resonating with people that had a very little understanding of the universe at that time. They had all kinds of interesting ideas about how the universe worked, but this story resonated with them, and it still resonates with us now, having some of the veil lifted, and we can see all these sorts of other truths of reality, but this story still resonates, and I think that's really important thing to take note of. So let me move on to my next. I got three people here I want to look at. This guy, his name is Science Mike. Now these are not the sort of typical conversion stories. I think these are, and they're not necessarily even conversion stories, but they're a little more. These people I'm talking about, it's a little more of the gray areas, okay? And a lot of people live in these areas between doubt and faith and figuring things out and experiences. And we're all at different places and working out our salvation, so to speak. And so this guy's story is really interesting. His real name is Mike McHargue. It's much easier to say Science Mike. That's what he's known as. He's the host and co-host of a podcast called Ask Science Mike, and he's the author of a book, Finding God and the Waves, How I Lost My Faith and Found It Again Through Science. Now, I like this guy's work. If it's not your cup of tea, that's okay. But it resonated with me, some of the things he went through. Mike was raised Southern Baptist. He was a deacon at his church. He married a Christian girl. They raised their kids in the faith of Christianity. He lost his faith when he was older, when his parents divorced. His dad left his family. He was the worship leader at the church. He tried to find a way to save his parents' marriage by delving into the scriptures and through his faith, and it didn't work. And left a deep psychic scar on him, and he lost his faith during this time. For whatever reason, that was the conduit for losing his faith. And a lot of us, there's a phrase, but for the grace of God, there go I. It's easy to kind of judge people in situations, but till we walk through them ourselves and have those kinds of experience sort of, tear through our lives, it can be unsettling. The very foundation of your whole world can fall apart. And what you think is super stable isn't always super stable. So anyways, this sort of opened him to start questioning his faith. And once that happened, it sort of, he went down the rabbit's trail. It opened a whole Pandora's box of questions that he had concerning the scriptures and his faith. And eventually he just stopped believing because he couldn't get the answers he wanted. He became an atheist. But his whole world was based on Christianity. His wife was Christian. He was a deacon at his church. He baptized his kids during this time. He was an atheist, but he hid it. He didn't tell anybody. Because culturally, that was his home. That's where he lived. And I think there's a lot of people who suffer through things in communities they don't feel like they can talk about. Doubt and struggles. And that's not an indictment necessarily of the church, but it's just, it happens. And again, hopefully our light is love, hope, and faith. And how do we walk through people with serious doubts whose faith is shattered and now they don't believe and don't know what to do? But it's interesting, he stayed in the Christian community. Now that could be said he just had enough sort of existing balls in the air there. He didn't want to disrupt the flow of his life, so he just stayed there. The interesting part here is one night he's in California, he's at a conference, and this is at nighttime. He's on the beach, and he had this mystical experience where he says God appeared to him in a bright light, and he felt God's love emanating through every fabric of his body. He was bewildered by this experience because he didn't believe in God, and God's showing up. He doesn't believe in him. So he was so thrown off by this, he immediately went and got CT scans on his head and went and saw a neurologist and all this stuff, and psychologist. Went through all this tests and research, and the answer he got back was he had a mystical experience. And I know these kinds of mystical experiences can be a little tricky, how much weight you put into them. How do you prove it? How do you disprove it? What was that experience? What did you really experience? But people have these things a lot, okay? And I think it's I wouldn't discount it just offhand. Just say that's just ridiculous and crazy. This guy had this experience as a total skeptic. He wasn't a believer. He was an atheist. He didn't know what to do with it. Suddenly, God shows up, and he's like, I don't believe in this, but it's happening. But it was a conduit to bring him back to faith eventually. And so he now describes himself as a Christian turned atheist turned follower of Jesus. And he really specifically works with people who have lost their faith. And there's a lot of people in these gray areas, guys, that they don't know what to do. They've been sort of educated as skeptics. They've been educated in Christianity, and they're sort of stuck in a gray area. And they've had mystical experiences, whether that be some thing on the beach where it seems like God showed up, drugs, whatever it is, music, mystical things that go beyond just the skepticism of our brain and hit us deep in our souls. A lot of us have these experiences, and they go beyond just simple reason. And he helps people. He helps people with that transition. He calls them transitions between faith and back to faith. And he's an interesting guy. So there's an interesting thing, and this is from a Washington Post article. Man, my time is almost, I can't believe this. I knew this. I went next door and printed out my notes, and I was like, oh, goodness, this is way too much. But anyways, we'll do what we can. So that's his podcast, Ask Science Mike. So this is from a Washington Post article that he wrote. He says, and this is sort of, he's talking about his story, and he says, millions of Americans have discovered that the ideas about God they grew up with were too rigid to stay with them as they got older. 44% of us will undergo a faith transition in our lives, but the exodus out of faith in this country leads to more people saying they are spiritual, not religious, than saying they are atheists. As I was saying, I think the conversation is going to change a little bit in the course of culture. Not so much just the staunch materialist atheist against the believer, but more of a I'm spiritual versus religious dogma. And I see it in my friends, and I've experienced it myself. That's a lot of the conversation that I see happening with folks my age and people younger. And there'll always be good old atheists there to fight with the church. Don't worry. Here's another quote here. I think one reason is that a lot of people have had their own moment on the beach, an experience so powerful that skeptical language can't describe it. Our brains seem to be wired to appreciate the numinous. But while skepticism has offered an essential critique of religion at its worst, it doesn't answer the human need for purpose and connection the way faith does. It's pretty powerful stuff there he's talking about. This last guy I want to talk about, they kind of look the same. That's Greg Boyd. He's a American theologian, pastor, and author. Woodland Hills Church in St. Paul, Minnesota. He's the president of renew.org. He's got some great books out. Just warning you, most of them are super weighty theological books. I really like them. They take a while to get through and comprehend, but it's great stuff if you ever look them up. I don't always agree with all of his points, everything he lands on, but he played a key role for me. This is a whole reason I'm bringing up in my faith. I don't have time to get into my story, but I went away. I was raised in faith, went away from faith, and came back. Similar to Science Mike, I guess. But during that time, when I came back to faith, some of his work really helped me because there were some really challenging experiences and sort of ideas in my head, and they continue to really help me. And he helped me as a way of looking at scriptures. And again, this we're still talking about Genesis here because Genesis has a lot in it. And once you start unpacking it, it can get pretty tricky pretty quick. And how do we digest this stuff? How do we look at it? And I want to look at there's a let's see where we're at here. So Greg, his story is similar too. He was became a believer. He had a pretty amazing conversion, and then he went off to there's a theme here happening. He went off to school, and he says his Christianity lasted one semester. This is a common thread here. It happens a lot, guys. And so I don't have time to unpack all that. We'll talk about that some other time. But so he said it took like a snarky professor throwing out a couple, big ideas, and his whole faith fell apart. He didn't know what to do with it. He wasn't prepared of how to deal with what he was the ideas he was being presented with in his faith. There was no flexibility. There was a rigidity to it that didn't allow for these other ideas. And it again, some of the fear is it's like a Jenga. You guys play Jenga? Like you pull this one piece out, the whole thing's gonna fall. And just like the Aristotelian theory, the earth is the center of the universe. That was their Jenga thing. The whole thing fell apart. And so they really hung on to that one. And sometimes that happens to us. And for him, he doesn't say exactly what it was, but it didn't last long, the reality of it. So he's got a message that really helped me. Tyler talks about it too. He hit me to it, and it's called "Toppling the House of Cards." It's, if you want to ever look it up, it's at Woodland Hills Church, whchurch.org. I don't have a link, but you can look at it if you Google that. It's there. It's a beautiful message. This is some of the work that really helped me early on in my faith, because I was really sort of had a lot of doubts and a lot of questions, and I didn't know exactly how to go about it. How do you keep your faith while asking skeptical questions at the same time? It's a tricky thing there. So this is one of the. So I'll just read. This is their little brief description of that message, which helped me. Its questions can sometimes topple faith like a house of cards. In this sermon, we introduce the idea that following Jesus is the central aspect of faith. This frees us to question and critique different aspects of our faith without losing that faith. So I was talking about this earlier. 1 in 5 Christian kids that go to secular college keep their faith. Those aren't very good odds. Boyd. Greg Boyd. Yeah. Boyd. So he talks about this, and that was his experience. And a lot of my friends, a lot of the people I've known in my life, same exact experience. It's almost, you can almost count on it happening. It's so common. Raised in Christian faith, go to school, and eventually, it doesn't always happen the same way, but eventually there's a trajectory there, and some people come back, some people don't. So he has this sort of idea of concentric circles of theology, and this one really helped me. And it's interesting because I was showing you those maps earlier, the Galileo maps and or Copernicus and Aristotelian, and they actually look the same. So I'm sure it's hard to read. They look like the same thing. So again, he calls it concentric circles of theology. Now, if none of this is your cup of tea, okay, whatever, that's fine. But this really helped me out. So let me just, I'm sure it's hard to read. There at the center is Jesus. Jesus is the common center. So that's the most important thing about our faith. Okay? So these go out in circles of importance. Okay? So the bigger, wider circles are issues we're passionate about, we care about, but it's not Jesus. Okay? They're issues we can debate about, but Jesus is the hill that we're that's the bullseye. That's the target. Okay? So this can help us have a lot of these conversations without totally losing the narrative of the story, the overarching story here. The whole point is Jesus, guys. It all leads to him. And so there's a lot of these things, there's debate, and again, it's amazing how intense it is and how nasty these things get from loving Christians who just hate each other because of their belief systems. And, there's a million, there's like 5 churches on this block. I'm sure a lot of it's about theology and stuff like that. And it's not that these things aren't important. They are important. But hopefully that's our bullseye. You know what I mean? Jesus. For us here at Life Point, that's our bullseye. That's what we're looking at. So the next circle here is dogma. It's an interesting term. It's been used by some theistic religious groups to describe the body of positions forming the group's most central, fundamental, and essential beliefs. This has to do with creeds. These are non-negotiables. So there are certain ideas in our faith that, no, we're sticking to this to the end. We're going down with this ship. That's fine. That's perfectly fine. There are those issues. But the tricky thing about getting into these subjects is where it goes. Where does this issue we're talking about go in the hierarchy of importance? Like, there's some stuff that's not going to go there. It's not a non-negotiable. You believe it, don't believe it, okay, whatever. I'm not dogmatic about it. There's a Kenneth Hagin quote about that. He believed in pre-Adamite civilizations, fascinating stuff. But he always said, I'm not dogmatic about it. And he made this really corny joke that I'm not puppy-matic about it. It's terrible. Yeah. But he's proving my point here. Exactly. Fascinating stuff. We love it. I love to chew the fat on it, but it's not a make or break issue. And some people have gone into these issues, and it's like Jeff always uses this example, and I'm going to steal it. And he worked at a golf course, and he was reading his Bible. I don't know, he was in, some check-in place or something. He happened to be reading his Bible, and this guy came in, and he was super angry about the Bible. And his whole point was that it didn't talk about dinosaurs. And it's a legit question. Where are the dinosaurs? It's not like we can just throw that out, like, whatever. But at the same time, he's missing the point of the narrative. He like, this is an amazing, beautiful work here in the scriptures. And to throw it all out because it doesn't talk dinosaurs is ridiculous. And again, that would be one of those issues in the concentric circles here that's probably a little farther out. So the next one, so we have Jesus, dogma, doctrinal issues that set forth our theological and spiritual identity. Important, but not totally necessary. Then matters of opinion, where we bear with each other in love. A lot of opinion and conjecture going on. And Jeff started with that, where he started really getting excited about Genesis because of what it didn't say. Actually, he started reading, wait a second, it didn't say that. People have been putting all this stuff in there as if it's there, and it's not. And that's part of the beauty of that story is I really believe some of that stuff's not there because it was made as a vehicle. These scriptures were made to go across vast time periods, spaces, peoples, cultures, and it's still relevant to all of them. It's not going to get bogged down with some of these issues. It's like, and they call it a sword, the scriptures, because it cuts through a lot of this stuff, these issues that are not really at the heart of the most important things concerning humanity. And that's what the scriptures do. They cut through all of that. There's a lot of, and it gives us hints. It doesn't leave us totally in the dark. And there's a lot of valid questions out there, man. It's like, why aren't you filling us in here? Why aren't you telling us just straight up what happened, about some things? And they'll give you hints here, and you're like, what is that? But again, it's about these, and it's not. I don't like the word simple because it makes it sound foolish. I don't mean it in that way. I mean, it takes really complicated ideas and makes it palatable to a cross section of people across time and space. These scriptures are, and we'll go on. And that's what they're made for. It's a beautiful, amazing document. I believe it's alive and living and breathed by the Spirit. And so, man, I just got to Genesis. That was my next point. We're running out of time here. I'll save it for them for next time. So we'll stop there. Again, this should, what I'm talking about right now should give us some freedom to really dig into this stuff without fear that the whole world's going to fall apart if we disagree. about some of these issues, okay? We have to be able to talk about this stuff without the sky falling. And I know some of these we're passionate about these issues, but if we could just chill a little bit and trust in Jesus as our guide, we'll be all right. All right, so let's say a prayer. I'll stop there for tonight. God, thank you so much for this time. Thank you for these awesome people coming out to study your word and to seek you, Lord. Bless them, Lord, as they continue to look to you and look for your light in their lives and in their walk, and help us, Lord. Give us light in these issues. Help us to discover things we haven't seen before. Help us to understand the world we're in and how to talk to people with questions and people with faith and people with doubt. And let the light that guides us be faith, hope, and love. In Jesus' name, amen. Good night.